Right now, somewhere over the Persian Gulf, an aircraft is moving slowly through the upper atmosphere at nearly 40,000 feet. From the ground, it would look completely ordinary. No escort fighters, no visible weapons, no dramatic maneuvers. Just a large jet tracing a wide, deliberate circle across an empty stretch of sky. Commercial pilots passing nearby would barely notice it. Air traffic controllers would simply see another military call sign moving across their radar scopes. But people who study military flight patterns noticed something unusual almost immediately, not because of what the aircraft was doing, because of where it was doing it. And for analysts who spend their careers watching military signals, aircraft like this raise a very specific question. Not what the aircraft is doing, but what someone believes might happen next. The Persian Gulf is not ordinary airspace. It sits at the center of one of the most sensitive strategic regions on Earth. Every radar contact, every naval movement, every unidentified aircraft is quietly monitored by analysts across several countries. And when this particular aircraft appeared in that airspace, the analysts watching those systems started asking a familiar question, not a loud question, a quiet one. Why now? Because aircraft like this do not fly randomly. They fly when planners believe something important might happen. And right now, something in the region has made military planners unusually cautious. If you zoom out from that aircraft's flight path, the geography beneath it begins to explain why. Below the jet lies a narrow corridor of water that connects the Persian Gulf to the wider oceans of the world. At first glance, it does not look extraordinary. On most maps, it appears as a thin blue channel between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. But that narrow channel controls something far larger than its geography suggests: energy. Every single day, enormous oil tankers move through that corridor carrying crude oil and natural gas toward markets thousands of miles away. Tankers loaded in Saudi Arabia, tankers departing Kuwait, ships carrying liquefied natural gas from Qatar, all of them pass through the same narrow gateway. The Strait of Hormuz. At its narrowest point, the strait is barely 21 miles wide, yet nearly a fifth of the world's oil supply moves through those waters. Which means that if anything interrupts traffic there, the consequences spread far beyond the Middle East. Energy markets react first, then shipping routes, then financial markets, and eventually entire national economies. For decades, strategists have quietly described Hormuz as the most sensitive energy choke point in the global system, but most of the time, it remains calm. Naval patrols operate in the region, military aircraft pass overhead, political tensions flare from time to time, yet the tankers keep moving. Recently, however, several small signals began appearing that suggested something might be changing. Commercial satellites detected unusual naval movements near the shipping lanes. Maritime insurance companies began adjusting their risk assessments for vessels traveling through the area. Energy traders, the people who watch geopolitical signals faster than most governments, began quietly pricing in the possibility of supply disruption. None of these developments alone would necessarily signal a crisis, but taken together they formed a pattern. And patterns like this attract attention, which brings us back to the aircraft circling above the Gulf. Because this is not a reconnaissance plane. It is not a fighter. It is not a bomber. In fact, it carries no weapons at all. Yet among military planners, it is considered one of the most important aircraft in existence. Not because of what it can destroy, but because of what it can connect. And the reason it exists traces back to one of the most uncomfortable questions strategists asked themselves during the Cold War. A question that becomes relevant whenever tensions between major powers begin to rise. What happens if the world's most powerful weapons suddenly lose the ability to communicate with the people who control them? That question led to the creation of one of the most unusual aircraft ever built. And the jet circling quietly above the Persian Gulf right now was designed specifically to answer it. But to understand why that matters, you first have to understand something most people never think about when they imagine nuclear weapons. The missiles themselves are not the real system. The real system is communication. And if that communication ever fails, the consequences could reshape the entire planet. For most people, the idea of nuclear weapons is easy to picture. Missiles buried deep underground, bombers sitting on runways, submarines hiding somewhere in the dark depths of the ocean. Those images are dramatic, and they are real. But what almost nobody outside military planning circles fully understands is that those weapons are only one part of a much larger system. Because a nuclear weapon by itself is not dangerous. Not truly. A missile sitting in a silo cannot decide to launch. A submarine, hidden thousands of miles away beneath the ocean, cannot guess when a command has been issued. Every nuclear arsenal on Earth depends on one fragile connection: the ability for a national leader to send an authenticated order through layers of military command to the crews responsible for operating those weapons. And if that connection fails, the most powerful weapons ever built suddenly become useless. Break that connection, and the entire deterrent system begins to collapse. This was one of the central fears of Cold War strategists. What would happen if a major war began and the systems used to communicate those orders suddenly stopped working? Imagine the scenario. Satellites disabled, command centers destroyed, communication networks jammed. In that moment, the most powerful weapons ever built might suddenly become unreachable. For the United States and the Soviet Union, this was not a theoretical question. It was a planning problem, and their answer was redundancy. Lots of it. They built hardened command bunkers buried deep underground. They installed communication cables capable of surviving nuclear blasts. They launched satellites designed specifically for military communication. They created mobile command centers capable of moving during a crisis. But even those systems had vulnerabilities. Satellites could be disabled. Ground infrastructure could be attacked. And that raised a disturbing possibility. What if the chain of command connecting national leadership to nuclear forces was broken in the opening hours of a conflict? That scenario led to one of the strangest engineering projects of the Cold War. An aircraft designed to remain airborne during a crisis and act as a flying communication node between leadership and strategic forces scattered across the planet. The aircraft eventually built for that mission was the Boeing E-6B Mercury. At first glance, it does not look especially threatening. It is based on an older jetliner design, a large aircraft packed not with bombs, but with communication equipment. But what sits inside that aircraft is something extraordinary, a system capable of maintaining contact with one of the most powerful military platforms ever created, the Ohio-class submarine. Hidden somewhere beneath the world's oceans are submarines carrying ballistic missiles capable of striking targets across entire continents. These submarines form one of the most important components of nuclear deterrence. Their strength is invisibility. They patrol silently through the oceans, deliberately avoiding detection. Sometimes they remain submerged for months. But that invisibility comes with a problem. Submarines operating deep underwater cannot receive normal radio transmissions. Water blocks most radio frequencies, which means once a submarine dives deep enough, it becomes almost completely isolated from the outside world. That isolation is useful for stealth, but it creates a communication challenge. And this is where the aircraft circling above the Persian Gulf becomes important. The E-6B Mercury carries specialized equipment capable of transmitting extremely low-frequency radio signals. During certain missions, the aircraft deploys a long trailing antenna behind it, sometimes stretching miles through the air. Using that antenna, it can send encoded signals capable of penetrating deep into the ocean, signals that can reach submarines operating far below the surface. Those signals are not ordinary radio chatter. They carry highly secure transmissions known as emergency action messages, messages that can authorize strategic responses under the most extraordinary circumstances. Because of that role, the aircraft earned a nickname among defense analysts, the doomsday plane, not because it launches nuclear weapons, but because it ensures that the command system behind those weapons continues functioning even under the worst imaginable conditions. And that is exactly why its presence above the Persian Gulf has attracted so much attention. Aircraft like this do not appear over regions experiencing complete geopolitical calm. They appear when planners want to guarantee that their most sensitive communication systems are active and ready, not necessarily because a nuclear conflict is imminent, but because tensions somewhere in the system are rising fast enough that planners want no gaps in the chain of command. And recently, tensions across the Middle East have been moving in exactly that direction. Because not long ago, something happened inside Iran that changed the strategic equation almost overnight. A strike. A strike that hit one of the most heavily defended facilities in the region. And once that strike occurred, the quiet stability that had defined the Strait of Hormuz for years began to look far more fragile. The aircraft circling above the Gulf may not carry weapons, but the system it represents exists for moments exactly like this, moments when the world begins to move closer to the edge of something far more dangerous. And to understand why that edge suddenly appeared, we need to look at what happened on the ground just days earlier, because the strike that triggered this escalation did not occur at sea. It happened deep inside Iranian territory, at a facility that had been the center of global concern for years, the Natanz nuclear facility, and the events that unfolded there would quickly ripple outward across the entire region. For months before the aircraft appeared over the Persian Gulf, pressure had already been building across the Middle East. At first, the signals were scattered. Drone attacks carried out by proxy groups, airstrikes exchanged along tense front lines, naval patrols moving through contested waters. None of these events were unprecedented. The region has lived with cycles of escalation for decades. Most of the time, those confrontations remain limited, intense but contained. But occasionally something happens that changes the trajectory of the entire system, and this time it began deep inside Iran. In the early hours of the morning, air defense radars monitoring Iranian airspace began detecting objects moving at extremely high speed. The tracks appeared suddenly, crossing large distances faster than conventional aircraft normally travel. Within minutes, explosions tore through multiple locations tied to Iran's nuclear program. The most significant damage appeared at the Natanz nuclear facility. For years, Natanz had been one of the most sensitive facilities in the country. Much of the site was buried underground and protected by layers of defensive systems designed specifically to survive an air attack, which made the strike even more significant, because the damage suggested a level of planning and precision that few militaries in the world could achieve. Satellite images taken later that day revealed sections of infrastructure destroyed and large portions of the facility temporarily shut down. Within hours, intelligence services across multiple countries began studying the aftermath. And while responsibility was never publicly confirmed, one assumption quickly spread through defense circles: Israel. For decades, the rivalry between Israel and Iran had been fought mostly in the shadows. Cyber attacks targeting infrastructure, covert sabotage operations, proxy conflicts stretching across Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Direct strikes inside Iranian territory were rare, which meant this attack carried a message far beyond the physical damage it caused. It suggested that the long-running confrontation between the two countries might be shifting into a far more direct phase. Inside Iran, the reaction was immediate. Government officials described the strike as an act of aggression that would not go unanswered. Military leaders from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued warnings that retaliation was already being prepared. But retaliation does not always take the form people expect. Iran could respond directly against Israel. It could target American military bases scattered across the region, or it could activate a strategy that Iranian planners had studied for decades, a strategy designed not just to pressure one country, but to shake the entire global economy. That strategy centered on a single location: the Strait of Hormuz. Every day, massive oil tankers carrying crude from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates pass through the narrow waters of the strait on their way to markets around the world. Roughly a fifth of the planet's oil supply moves through that corridor, which means even a temporary disruption could send shockwaves through global energy markets. Iran has long understood the leverage embedded in that geography. Over the years, Iranian military planners developed strategies specifically designed for the strait: naval mines capable of damaging large vessels, fast attack boats that could swarm tankers moving through narrow shipping lanes, coastal missile batteries positioned along the shoreline, and drones capable of striking ships far out at sea. Individually, none of these tools would defeat a major navy, but they would not need to. The objective would simply be disruption. Even a small number of damaged ships, or credible reports of mines in the water, could force commercial traffic to slow dramatically while naval forces worked to secure the area. And that alone would be enough to rattle the global economy. Recently, several signals began suggesting that parts of this strategy might be moving from theory toward reality. Commercial satellite imagery detected Iranian vessels operating unusually close to major shipping routes. Maritime insurance companies quietly increased premiums for ships traveling through the region. Energy traders began adjusting their models to account for possible supply disruptions. None of these signals alone confirm that the Strait of Hormuz will be closed. But taken together, they indicate that the situation is becoming increasingly volatile. And that volatility is exactly why military forces across the region have begun quietly repositioning themselves. Carrier groups shifting closer to the Gulf, air defense systems being reinforced, naval patrols increasing around the shipping lanes, and high above it all, the Boeing E-6B Mercury continues its slow orbit in the sky. A silent reminder that the systems designed for the most extreme scenarios are now fully active. Because when tensions reach this level, military planners prepare for outcomes far beyond the first strike. And the next phase of this crisis may not be decided by missiles or drones. It may be decided by something much more fragile: the movement, or the sudden absence, of oil tankers through the narrow waters of the Strait of Hormuz. There are certain places in the world that function like hidden pressure points in the global system. They are not large cities. They are not famous landmarks. Most people could not even find them on a map. But when something happens there, the consequences ripple outward across the entire planet. The Strait of Hormuz is one of those places. At its narrowest point, the channel is just over 20 miles wide. Two thin shipping lanes guide massive oil tankers through the water, moving energy from the Persian Gulf to the rest of the world. Every day, dozens of enormous vessels pass through that corridor. Tankers loaded in Saudi Arabia, tankers departing Kuwait and Iraq, liquefied natural gas carriers leaving Qatar. Together, they carry nearly a fifth of the world's oil supply, energy that powers factories, transportation networks, and entire national economies thousands of miles away. Under normal circumstances, the system runs with remarkable efficiency. Ships enter the strait. They follow designated lanes through the narrow waters. Then they disperse toward ports in Asia, Europe, and beyond. But the system depends on one fragile assumption: that those waters remain open. When uncertainty enters the strait, the first place it appears is not on television screens. It appears in the maritime insurance market. Companies that insure oil tankers operate quietly behind the scenes of global trade. Their job is to calculate risk: piracy risk, weather risk, war risk. when those companies suddenly raise premiums for ships passing. Through a region, it means their analysts have detected something worrying, not a rumor, a probability. Recently, those insurance premiums began rising sharply for vessels entering the Strait of Hormuz. And when that happens, ship captains begin to hesitate. Some slow their routes, some delay entry into the corridor, others wait outside the strait entirely until the situation becomes clearer. The result is something unusual. A queue of enormous tankers sitting in open water, waiting, each one carrying millions of barrels of oil, each one part of the machinery that keeps the global economy moving. Meanwhile, financial markets begin reacting in real time. Oil traders adjust supply expectations. Currencies of energy importing countries begin shifting. Stock markets start pricing in the possibility of economic disruption. The countries that feel the pressure first are often those most dependent on imported energy. Japan, South Korea, India, China. All of them rely heavily on oil shipments passing through the Persian Gulf. If the flow through Hormuz slows dramatically, their economies feel the shock almost immediately. Governments begin planning emergency responses. Strategic oil reserves are discussed. Diplomatic messages start moving quietly between capitals. Naval patrols increase across the region. Because when global trade routes become unstable, naval power inevitably becomes part of the equation. The United States maintains a powerful military presence across the Gulf through carrier strike groups and regional bases. Its mission, in principle, is simple: ensure freedom of navigation through one of the most important waterways on Earth. But enforcing that mission inside a volatile environment is anything but simple. Naval mines can be hidden beneath the surface. Fast attack boats can appear suddenly among commercial vessels. Drones can approach shipping lanes with very little warning. Which means every radar contact inside the strait now matters. Every unidentified vessel, every aircraft crossing overhead, every signal picked up by naval surveillance systems. And above it all, still circling quietly through the upper atmosphere, is the Boeing E-6B Mercury. An aircraft designed not for ordinary combat operations, but for a far more serious purpose, maintaining command of the most powerful weapons ever created. Its presence does not mean those weapons will be used, but it does mean the system behind them is active, connected, ready. That signal alone carries enormous weight in the language of military strategy. Because crises like this rarely unfold through a single dramatic event. They unfold through chains of reactions. One action triggers another. One signal prompts a response. One miscalculation changes the entire trajectory of events. In Washington, military planners are watching radar feeds from the Gulf. In Tehran, commanders inside the Revolutionary Guard are calculating their response. In Beijing and New Delhi, energy analysts are studying tanker traffic through Hormuz, and somewhere above them all, the aircraft continues to circle. And right now, as tankers wait outside the strait and naval forces maneuver cautiously across the Gulf, the world is entering the most delicate phase of the crisis. The moment where decisions made by a small number of leaders could determine whether the system stabilizes or moves one step closer to something far more dangerous. The most dangerous moments in international crises are rarely the loudest ones. They are the quiet intervals in between, the hours when ships stop moving, when governments stop issuing public statements, when military forces remain in position, watching each other carefully, waiting for the next signal. Right now, the waters of the Strait of Hormuz are entering exactly that kind of moment. Across the region, massive oil tankers remain anchored outside the narrow corridor connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. Some are moving slowly, waiting for confirmation that the route ahead is safe. Under normal conditions, this passage functions like an artery for the global economy. Ships enter the strait, follow the designated lanes through the narrow channel, and continue toward refineries scattered across Asia and Europe. But when uncertainty enters the system, everything slows down. Shipping companies wait, insurance premiums rise, naval patrols intensify, and the global economy begins to feel a quiet tension building beneath the surface, because nearly a fifth of the world's oil supply still depends on this narrow stretch of water. If traffic slows for a few days, markets react. If it slows for weeks, governments begin worrying. If it slows for months, the consequences reach far beyond energy prices. Entire economies can feel the shock. That is why governments across the world are watching the Persian Gulf so closely. In Washington, military planners are studying how to maintain open shipping lanes without triggering a wider confrontation. Carrier strike groups already operating in the region have the capability to escort commercial vessels and clear potential threats from the water. But every military operation inside a tense maritime corridor carries risk. A drone detected too late. A radar signal misinterpreted. A missile launched in retaliation for something that was never intended as an attack. Any of these could transform a fragile standoff into open conflict. Inside Iran, the calculations are just as complicated. Leaders in Tehran must decide how to respond to the strike that damaged facilities like the Natanz nuclear facility without triggering a war that could threaten the stability of the country itself. Symbolic retaliation might satisfy domestic pressure, but large-scale escalation could invite overwhelming military response. In Israel, Leaders are watching the same equation unfold from the opposite side. The strike on Iran's nuclear infrastructure was designed to slow a strategic threat. Yet every strategic strike produces consequences elsewhere in the system. Now the question is how far those consequences will spread. Beyond the Middle East, other major powers are watching carefully. China depends heavily on energy shipments moving through Hormuz. India's rapidly expanding economy relies on the same supply routes. European countries, already dealing with the aftermath of previous energy disruptions, understand that another shock to global oil markets could ripple through their economies, which means this crisis has grown into something larger than a regional confrontation. It has become a global strategic moment. And in moments like this, the outcome rarely depends on technology alone. It depends on decisions. History offers a powerful reminder of how narrow those decision windows can be. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world came dangerously close to nuclear war before leaders on both sides stepped back from the brink. What prevented catastrophe was not superior weapons. It was judgment, restraint, the willingness to recognize how dangerous the situation had become. Today's crisis is very different in many ways, but the underlying pattern feels familiar. A regional confrontation has begun intersecting with global interests. Military forces are already moving. Economic pressure is already building. Diplomatic channels are working quietly behind the scenes, and the next step could send events down very different paths. One path leads toward stabilization. Shipping lanes reopen, energy markets calm, the crisis slowly fades from headlines. The other path leads somewhere far more uncertain. Retaliation triggers retaliation. Regional actors are drawn into the conflict, and the fragile balance that has kept the global energy system functioning begins to crack. Which path the world follows will depend on choices made in a handful of rooms by leaders working with incomplete information and enormous pressure. For now, the ships are still waiting. The strait remains under watch, and high above the Persian Gulf, the Boeing E-6B Mercury continues its silent orbit. A reminder that the systems built for the most extreme scenarios remain ready. The ships are still waiting. The strait remains under watch. And somewhere high above the Persian Gulf, the aircraft continues its silent orbit. A reminder that the systems built for the most extreme scenarios are now fully awake. What happens next will depend on decisions made in rooms most of the world will never